Welcome to the Inferno Cast. I'm here with one of our friends, Eddy Fyvie from New York. He's a Brazilian Jiu Jitsu black belt and has a very interesting background in the martial arts that he's going to be talking about today. How's everything going for you today, Eddy?
Good, hanging in there, just trying to make it through everything that's going on with COVID-19 and hoping that my school survives after it.
Absolutely, man. I think that's where everybody's at. And that's kind of the inspiration for what we're doing here was just trying to inspire and influence people while they're stuck at home and they can't go to the gym, they can't train, and also try to help educate everybody because there's a lot of people in our industry that have some amazing stories and part of the history that I think a lot of people could learn from. And that's kind of where you come up. So we got connected by Jack Toffer,
Yeah.
mutual friend who is a crazy man, but, one of my best buds. And so I'm really excited to kind of ask you some questions and let everybody hear your story. So if
Cool.
you were going to say when martial arts really impacted you, when you were a kid or a teenager, like when was it for you that you were thinking, man, I need to get into some martial arts?
Honestly, I think that when I was around like 4 or 5 years old, I was like really into pro wrestling, and that was my thing. Like watching it, I was just always obsessed. I was never into superheroes. I was never into like comic books or anything like that. But like pro wrestling, like that was my thing. So when I grew up in a really, really bad neighborhood and, I had tons of things happen to me as a kid. And I was a smaller kid. I wasn't big. And kind of being, I was the minority in the neighborhood that I lived in. So I was always searching for something. And boxing was like a natural route, and like them wrestling and pee-wee wrestling, stuff like that. But nothing that really like settled with me. So when I was 10, I saw the UFC, Hoist Gracie, much like everybody else. And I thought I was going to watch I thought it was like a hardcore pro wrestling at first. Like I didn't realize I was going to be watching this like real actual fight. So I saw Hoist Gracie and I saw him shoot a double leg. And I knew that from, doing Pee Wee wrestling. And I was confused at first. I was like, why is this karate guy shooting takedowns? Didn't make sense to me. So after I saw him just dismantle everybody, I was like, I have to find that. Like, that's it right there. That's a secret. And so there were some guys locally in my area. I'm actually in upstate New York, so I'm like 3 hours north of the city. And there were some guys training locally that had wrestling backgrounds, judo backgrounds that were just training on videotapes. And that's who I started with, pretty much.
Yeah, man, it's just like the VHS era of martial arts learning. It's funny because like, especially in our industry, you always hear people that are like, oh man, you're not going to learn off YouTube, like that's not the way to go.
Yeah.
Whenever most people in this industry started on VHS tapes, that were copies of copies of copies with all the fuzziness stuff in there.
Yeah.
That's how I got my start too, is like watching VHS tapes of instructionals or private lessons, things of that nature. So,
Panther Productions was a big one back in the day.
oh, that was it, man. Like that was
Black Belt magazine. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the first one that, and it was a good introduction. And granted, our resources now are so much better, with social media, but also with just, the immersion training you can do with all the jiu-jitsu schools. Yeah, but most people kind of got their start like, well, man, I watched this VHS tape of UFC, then I found some instructionals. So that's cool that you kind of fell into Brazilian jiu-jitsu first, because, a lot of people, they end up like in karate or taekwondo or, or something like that first, then made their transition. What do you think was different for you, kind of finding the grappling first? Was it because you knew what you're looking for or what?
Well, it was kind of funny. Like I've thought about this a lot too, is the neighborhood I lived in, like if you did karate or taekwondo, it was goofy. Like it was just, it didn't fit. Boxing was popular, even wrestling, like, me like wrestling. And I remember one time, like I took a kid down I was fighting with, and I remember people like being confused, like the other kids in my school being like, get up, get up, get up, get up, what are you doing, get off him. And so the idea of any like traditional martial art or anything that went against kind of like the street mentality or like where I came from didn't make sense. So I can remember being a kid, like when I was 8 years old, I got brought to a karate class and I was like, this is not anything what I'm looking for at all. Like when do we hit people? Like what's going on here? We're like making noises and screaming. And so just as a kid, I think the neighborhood I grew up in, just there was always a negative undertone about it, and kids didn't do it. There's like, kids just didn't do that. So there was like boxing at a boys club close to me and stuff. So I just always thought from as a little kid, that's why I didn't like superheroes. I didn't like Ninja Turtles or anything like that. I would watch it and I would just kind of not be into it. So I think that's when I saw jujitsu and I saw how real it was. And it was more so the fact that I saw this guy who wasn't big, who I can relate to. That's what really did it for me. And I could see how it worked right away because I was wrestling. I was doing Pee-wee wrestling. So
Yeah, makes
I could
sense.
see the takedown. And I at that time too, like right when I watched it, actually, like I'd been wrestling for like a year and I had 2 altercations and I took kids down and like cradled them. And I was like, I felt like on top of the world for that year because I was like, I'm finally like beating kids up. It wasn't like I'd hoped, but so it made sense to me and nothing else really made sense to me at that time.
Yeah, no, I get that. So whenever you first went to class and you started training, was there any major epiphanies of like, man, this is way more complicated than I thought it was? Or was everybody pretty rudimentary to where it was kind of like everybody was flopping around like a fish, kind of learning together?
Yeah, we had kind of a weird situation up here. I started and I had already been watching and obsessed with the UFC for like a year. And when I found I didn't think that a jiu-jitsu school in my area was even like a possibility. I thought it was some, Brazilian like secret martial art that you had to be in Brazil for. I didn't realize because there was no resources to like look it up. You look in the phone book, there's nothing. So back in the Yellow Pages days. And so I just assumed that it didn't exist around me. So I was like trying to learn from watching the UFC. I'd like grab my dad and like try to put him in an arm bar and stuff. And so when I started, I actually was really familiar with the terminology. And so I was a step up when I started.
Yeah.
Um, and then they trained my area, actually, they had been training for a few years. And one of the guys was going to like Henzo's on the weekend in the city and coming back. And this group of like wrestler, judo kind of mixture of people. So there was a few guys that actually got pretty good that started winning pretty well in the tournament scene early on and fighting MMA like in 98, 99, those time periods. So we had kind of like this weird little group that was doing pretty well up here. But yeah, I mean, when I started, I was already so obsessed with it that I kind of just rolled into it kind of smoothly. But
Yeah.
I'd say the main thing was just the development of training over the years. Back then it was like, should we roll? Should we time it? Should we punch each other? Should we open hand? You put boxing gloves on, I'll try to take you down. It's like, let's bring this guy in from the gym. Let's try to beat him up. Like,
Yeah.
so that I'd say the lack of understanding of training was the big thing.
Yeah. Programming in those days, of just like what you need to do, when, and how much. That was the unknown. And that's where, you can really look at MMA's evolution as a good, measuring stick of a sport that is getting smarter because like football went through the same thing, but I mean, that was like 80 years ago. So a lot of
Yeah.
us just aren't familiar, but you look at the original football training and equipment and methodology and they didn't train as smart and scientific as they do now. And you see the same thing with MMA, jiu-jitsu, even boxing, like all these other sports, they're starting to get smarter because like you kind of hinted around at something was if you did jiu-jitsu in the 90s, you were doing MMA and Valley Tudo also.
Yeah. More,
Like that was
yeah, it
because
was a
that's
natural.
what brought people there. Was
That's what
like, yeah, so you couldn't really go to a jiu-jitsu club like you can now and never get punched in the face.
Yeah.
That
Or
just
never
didn't
even hear the
exist.
word punch.
Yeah, yeah,
There's,
it just,
never even talk about it.
yeah, it definitely, that was one of those things that was correlated back then that, now, which probably impacted, because it grew fast, but it probably could have grown faster had it been a little bit more systematized and structured like it is now, because now
Yeah.
it's just everywhere. But back then, at least 1 or 2 days a week, somebody was in Speedos and wearing some Harbinger bag gloves with the bar cut out, like, we're going to hit each other today.
Oxygenics with the like the Red Cross logo there.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's I do think it ebbs and flows too. I think that humans complicate things. So I do see it kind of like it kind of went through this like where it became really advanced and super systematized and it is right now. But I think that and then I think it started to miss it threw away all that stuff that people were doing. And I think that kind of messed with things a little bit. I feel bad for some of my students sometimes because not because they're not getting punched in the face, but because their initial why did you start? Oh, I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast. It's like, so the reality is like they're being told a story about this thing, right? Like when you or I started in particular, like I saw magic, literal, real magic, something that you couldn't even imagine in your head existing. And I have my students, I say, go back and watch UFC 1, the whole thing, not the fights. Go watch the whole thing where commentators were talking about there's going to be ground fighting tonight. Like you're like, ground fight? Why is anybody fighting on the ground? But so I actually feel bad sometimes because they didn't get that first shock that like, oh my
Yeah.
God, my whole world's turned upside down. To now it's like normal. Grappling is normal. Everybody's heard of Jiu Jitsu, Gracie. Yeah, it's become a mainstream thing. So it's and it's kind of like it's changed things a lot. But so I do think that it's kind of returning in a way. I think it's balancing out. I think people are realizing that we've been missing all this stuff for a long time. I think we've been missing in our hunt for trophies and sport. I think we've kind of messed with the art a little bit. So I do think it's returning a little bit, but yeah, who knows? It's a constant evolution.
Well, I mean, overcompensation, happens a lot. I mean, because like the UFC, taking the martial arts to the degree of what UFC 1 through 4 was a little bit of an overcompensation, and then when it veers back and then that becomes its own sport, everything finds its way and people will find their groove. But definitely that moment in time was just one of those things. I mean, it's like being there when the Eiffel Tower was completed. I mean, it's just there's moments in time where you can't replace it, especially within the martial arts realm. For us to come through growing up on 80s martial arts movies and then roll into the 90s with the UFC and advent that pushes this mixed martial arts that goes back to this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu style that kind of started it all, that has now like just kind of taken over the planet. Definitely a miraculous time.
Oh, for sure.
Be involved. Yeah.
And rapid too. It was a rapid change, I think, and I don't think we were prepared for that either. I think that the rapid development of things, like, now it's like at my academy, like we do a good job of like separating what's what. So, we have jujitsu versus unskilled. We have jujitsu versus jujitsu. And then you have mixed martial arts, which is a sport with a parameter set of rules and things like that. So now we've kind of gone, okay, what is all of this stuff? Because for a while it was just kind of like jumbled. Like, okay, well, should we just start striking more, or should we just go the sport route, or what should we do? So now it's kind of, we figured it out in a sense. We've kind of like, the chips have fallen and we figured out kind of where to place things more or less. So I think that's been a good thing. But there was a time period, it was a rapid change. We didn't know we weren't ready for it to deal with it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because who would have guessed that a bunch of Americans would go crazy over UFC? Because like you listen to the guys talk, and like the UFC thing was organized to like promote Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the Gracie videos and their theology. Their whole idea was like, oh, this is a thing. People want to keep watching it. Like that was not part of the plan.
Yeah.
That, they quickly pivoted to, but it was just like, oh,
That's what I tell my students. I go, there's really only supposed to be one.
Yeah.
It was UFC. It was
Yeah, that was it. But then we're crazy. So everybody's like, this is awesome. Let's keep going.
Yeah.
So when you're doing jiu-jitsu up there, when did you make the transition to where like it got serious, where like you found legitimate leadership, real education, you're plugged in? When did that happen?
We had a guy move up here from New Jersey named Chad Beatty. And I had been, as a kid, I never trained with kids. So I would only train with adults. And like, I had my first fights in the gym when I was like 13 against a 17-year-old and things like that, like actual fights and stuff. And because it was crazy. And I was kind of like, I was in a weird situation because as a kid, like day one, I walked in, I was like, yep, this is what I'm gonna do forever. Like, which messed with my academic schooling because I went back to school that day and went, this is all pointless. I don't need to be here, which isn't totally true, but I knew what I wanted to do at 10. And so when I was about 13 or 14, we had a guy move up from New Jersey who was a purple belt under Ricardo Almeida, and a purple belt in the year 2000 or 2001 was like,
oh man, that's a unicorn.
Yeah. And the guys I was training with had fake black belts. So, and which I didn't know until around that time period, we started to figure out like, wait a second, where did he get his belt? Yeah, but this doesn't make any sense. And, they just disappeared. So this guy moved up. He was a purple belt, and when I saw him, I knew him from the tournaments because I was going to tournaments and doing kids divisions, and I was winning everything. Like I was when I was like 12 and 13, I started to go into like the 16-year-old division, and when I was 15, I started to do the adult division, and so I was doing really well, even having very limited, training with people. But so when he moved up here, I went, wow, that guy's like, that's what I've been looking for right there. So I pretty much started training exclusively with him. And a few guys I was training with moved over to train with him. And we just kind of built this little training bubble there. And at that time, he was just teaching the classes in his garage, in his basement. And we had like this basement crew, and like, it was crazy. We had Ricardo Almeida would come stay for a week. Fabio Leopoldo was down there for a week. Like, all these guys would just come down to the basement and train. And it was cool. And then around, when I was like 17, then from during that time period, I was making like monthly trips, like Matt Serra's, Ricardo Almeida's, and training as much as possible.
Man, Matt Serra's a name I hadn't heard in years, because I was always a big Matt Serra fan growing up whenever I was a bit younger, when he was a younger fighter.
Yeah, I was a little kid. When those guys that, I'd go to these tournaments, I had like no coach, right? And so I wouldn't have a coach, and like there's this little 13-year-old kid walking around, just my dad. And I remember Matt Serra walked in right around the time he fought Shoney Carter. I remember going to my dad like, oh man, that's Matt Serra. He just fought in the UFC. He's a Henzo black belt. And it was like crazy, right? So my dad at this tournament, I got that kind of push mentality from my dad. Like he would like embarrass me as a kid, just like go out of his way to talk to people. But he went up to Matt Serra, started talking to him, called me over, and Matt goes, hey, how you doing? Blah, 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 whatever. And he goes, where do you train? I told him Albany, New York. And he goes, oh, cool. He goes, who's your coach? I'd love to meet him. I go, oh, they're not here. And he goes, who's coaching you? I go, I don't have a coach. I just go out and whatever. And he goes, I'll coach you. He goes, come over and get me before your match. So he came over and coached me for an hour, like that whole tournament, every match. I didn't know this guy, wouldn't take any money from my dad, like nothing. A couple months later, I was in another tournament, tapped me on the shoulder. He's like, Eddy, right? I go, yeah. And he goes, you got a coach today? I go, no. He goes, I'll coach you. Walks away. Coach me every match. So like those two moments, I was like, that guy's the guy right there. Like, I'll do anything for that guy. So I'd say around 2001, I started to really like figure out what was what and what I needed to be doing and stuff like that. And then it continues to change. So yeah, probably around that time period.
Well, that was probably an important transition for you too, especially when you get to the point where you can see degrees of authenticity, where it's like, where you can see the different levels, because I can remember training with some world-class champions that were the biggest deal in the world, and I had no idea, because my overall comprehension was so low,
right,
that it just felt like every other guy that was better than me, it was just, it was a blur. Because I was like, yeah, he's really good, but even though it's like one of the best guys in the world, really good. But to me, I'm just like, hey, the guy that comes down here every couple of weeks, he's better than me too, So the fact that you were able to start hitting that discernment, and being so close to New York and in the city, you really were close to a hotbed of a lot of talent with all the guys that were up there, and kind of that authentic, the real deal, to where at least you had access. Because a lot of people in the world, man, they didn't have that at all till mid to late 2000s, with any kind of legitimacy connected.
When it kind of spread. So it was fortunate. It was fortunate there, and that time period too was like 2000, 2001. There was like really big Abu Dhabi tournaments. Yep. The UFC was just becoming like just getting back on pay-per-view.
Yep.
So it was like a time period. Like, it's an amazing thing. Like, this guy moved up here at the time when all of these guys down there were really like going 100% full force. Henzo was fighting all the time. Matt Serra was fighting UFC. Ricardo was fighting. So it was like, it was a great time period to really like make that transition.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. So you guys are in the basement. When did it turn into like a career path for you? Like, what was the transition when you were like, hey, I'm finally out of high school, or I'm done with this, I'm going to monetize this? Was there a transition for that, or was there a like, I'm going to go make money fighting in the UFC? What was the answer there of this becoming a career for you?
I fought with my teachers I knew it, like I said, day one, as soon as I walked in, I'm like, I want to be Hoist Gracie. That's who I want to be. Like, I want to fight, and that's it. And it just something about it. But I fought with my teachers and my guidance counselors, like all from middle school all the way up through high school, constantly, like barely graduating, like I graduated at 65, like I found out on the day of graduation. And I always knew that it was what I was going to do. My plan was I graduated high school at 17. And as soon as I graduated, I moved down to New Jersey and started training for my first pro fight. And then I turned 18 in October, so that summer, and then I had my first pro fight. So that was the game plan for me since like day one. And then like as I started fighting, I fought from probably I was like 18 until I was about 8 years, so until I was about 26, 27. And then that's when it kind of like the fighting MMA kind of just lost I just lost a desire to do it, really, I guess. Like I tell people, it's like one day like my switch was turned off. So and then that was when I became really serious about like, okay, I'm gonna this gym that I'm teaching at, I was teaching since I was 18 full time, 5 days a week. And so this gym that I was been teaching at all this time, like I'm gonna buy it. I bought it out, and then that was around 2013, and then it's just been going ever since. So I'd say like 2005 when I had my first fight, like that's when the professional aspect of it started. But there was no money in fighting back then. Like, I mean, like $100 for my first fight and something like that. But
there's still no money in fighting unless you're like
yeah,
the top, 3 guys. I mean, it's like,
yeah, there really isn't. And it's it's a nice scheme they got going on there. But that was another thing that kind of like drew me away from it, was like, as I started to understand the business side of it more, it just, you lose hope in a sense, in some regard. But yeah, so I always knew that it was going to be something that I was going to do in one way, shape, or form, whether that would be making it to a high level in the UFC. Cool. I always knew that I'd be teaching. I started teaching like as soon as I got done with high school, or teaching full time. So yeah, it was kind of always a natural thing for me. Like one way or the other, it was going to be something. And I just kind of let it go. And then when I took over my gym, that's when I got really, really focused on like the business side of it and figuring that out. I had no skills whatsoever business wise or anything. I just took it over, and I was like, well, I've been at the gym for my whole life. So there's students and they pay this much. And like, that's the extent of what I knew.
yeah.
So, which isn't good, but that was it. Yeah. So, I mean, pretty much forever, there was no really point in time where it wasn't going to be what I was going to do.
Absolutely. So
yeah.
on the fight career, so I got to ask, so what's the shadiest MMA show that you ever got to go to that you were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening?
Oh, well, honestly, that the worst ones were actually after I got done fighting. What happened was in New York. New York just became legal, which, the sport kind of like, that was another thing that ruined it for me, was the fact that it was illegal for so long in New York. Anytime I wanted to fight, I'm going to Montreal, I'm going to Atlantic City, I'm going to Massachusetts. So it's like, you're traveling 4 hours to have your fight. Promoters are paying fighters off ticket sales. I can't sell tickets 5 hours away every other month. I mean, once a year. Yeah. So I'm getting thrown to the wolves every single fight. And so it was tough. And then the sport kind of died down in this area. Like, people just stopped training MMA because it's a dead end. Like, where are you going to go? So then what happened was, in New York, they found this, like, it was illegal, but they figured out a loophole. There were some guys that were trying to hold like this mixed event of like kickboxing 1 round, Jiu Jitsu the 2nd round. And their lawyers basically told them, they said, professional MMA is illegal, not amateur. And so they started having these amateur fights that were unsanctioned, just like, and that was for about like 4 years, I'd say, of my students, like having some of my students in, our guys would win most of the time, but there'd be events where like guys are puking on each other in the fight. They're outside 100 degrees, or like leaf blowing the mat. I mean, it's like stuff like that. So like late in my career, where I just like, guys, no training, a guy leaves, gets drunk at the bar and comes back and fights. Yeah. Like, just crazy stuff like that. My first fights, luckily, like I fought in Atlantic City and, with reality fighting, a Ring of Combat and stuff like that. So I was always with promoters that knew how to promote events. from early on. So I was lucky in that regard. You know, I'd say some of the weirder things were like when I fought in Canada and I, you know, one time I went to the weigh-in and they used to have this rule in Canada that if you miss weight, they cancel your fight at the weigh-in. There's no like hour, there's no go make the weight. So I was supposed to fight this guy, Mike Ritchie, who was on the Ultimate Fighter show. He had a pretty good career. He's like Rory McDonald's, you know, friend or whatever. And he got KO'd in training like the week of the fight. So he was out. So they brought this guy in. I was fighting at 155 at the time. They brought this 170 pounder in, Stefan Lamarche. And I was like, you sure he can make 155? Because he just fought at 185 like 3 months ago. And they're like, yeah. And they just, you know, pushed me along. And I was up there. I'd never even been to Canada. So I didn't realize in Montreal, like I was like the enemy up there. I didn't speak French or anything. So I walked into this place like everybody hates me. I don't even know what, I just showed up. So this guy shows up to the weigh-in like on his deathbed, and they come up to me real quick with a contract. They're like, he's not going to make weight. I go, okay, so what now? They're like, you have to fight him at 165. I was like, okay. I mean, I'm here. I was natural 155 pounder too at the time. So I fought the guy, we weighed in. And then the next day, the fight, he was like 190 pounds, 185 pounds, something crazy. And it was just like, and then guys are rapping, like casting their hand in the back. There was no commission. So up there was some crazy stuff then. It's changed a lot now, but crazy stuff then. That event ended up getting shut down because it was run by the mafia. And I was like, I don't know.
For the mob in Canada, that's awesome.
The Italian mobs, that's where the Italian mob is, in Montreal.
That's crazy.
That's where they're the biggest. They moved from New York. They're up in Montreal. The morning of one of my fights, actually, there was a mob hit right in front of our hotel. And I fought on a fight card up in Canada called Warrior One. I fought Antonio Carvalho, who was really good featherweight. Fought in UFC a bunch. He was a third-ranked featherweight in the world at one point. And I was his comeback fight after a shoulder injury. This fight card had Vernon Tiger White, Pat Healy, John Alessio, Jason McDonald, Shoney Carter was on this fight card. It was like a who's who of like MMA guys, right? And I walked in, and Vanderlei Silva was there cornering people. It was crazy. I walked out for the first fight to just check things out, and there was like 100 people in the crowd. I'm like, whoa, this isn't, what's going on? Where is everybody?
Yeah.
And then apparently that event, like when you go up there to fight at that time period, if you don't, you know, do your thing with the mafia up there, with the mob, then you're not going to have an event. So this event was from Ontario in Montreal, different province, and they didn't meet with the right people. So the mob bought all the tickets. So they thought the event was sold out, but it wasn't sold out. The tickets were like stolen basically.
Yeah.
So they sold 100 tickets and their investor lost like 300 grand. The whole event got shut down. It was crazy. So up there, I had some weird experiences. That was different.
Yeah, no, and then, you know, everybody's got stories of, you know, crazy shows. I mean, like we were in a rodeo arena one time. I remember one time the fence busted open, like, and so every time the blue corner had to hold the fence up, you know, like during the fight, it was all like, you guys hold
yeah,
the
we got that. Yeah.
corner. You know, and of course, always shady business and things of that nature, you know, which follows about any industry. But it's, you know, sometimes it's funny to hear these old stories of crazy stuff and things that were like,
it was crazy. Yeah, we had a similar thing where the ropes broke at this event in Massachusetts, and Rampage Jackson was doing commentary over a loudspeaker to the crowd for all the fights. He was just making fun of every fighter.
Yeah.
The whole night. It was awful. But yeah, it's crazy world. But luckily things are kind of professionalizing a little bit, I guess.
Absolutely, man. I mean, I feel like the industry's had a complete reform, you know, and it's fun to be a part of those stories, but at the same time, like, man, you know, it was just so unsafe and crazy.
Oh, yeah.
I just think back of all the injuries and people that have probably died that we just don't even keep up with. It just got looked over. That's like, oh
yeah,
man, you know,
yeah,
because you know it was happening, and like you said, people showing up, they're out of shape, not training, health issues, drug, alcohol, etc. It's like, because you know that did exist, but back to the jiu-jitsu. So when you took over the school, were you specifically BJJ, or was it like a mix, a hybrid kind of thing? I mean, what did that look like as far as your programs?
I think when I took it over, we were still kind of, we had like an MMA team, but when I took it over, I was like, okay, I got to like really nail down this business. And I kind of watched Ricardo Almeida go through a transformation at his gym where around like 2004 and 2005, he had retired from MMA and he wanted to revitalize his gym. He started working with some guys and he took all MMA out of the gym. There was no MMA in the gym. There's no training there. So all these fighters that were training either went and started training somewhere else or like were training privately and then going to Ricardo's for jiu-jitsu.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got to see him like really take his, but in that time period, he took his school from like, you know, double digit numbers up to like 400 students, like rapidly. So when I took my gym over, we had a couple of guys that were fighting MMA. And so we kind of like, you know, that still existed and they would train and stuff like that. But it was crazy up here. Anyway, we had to go 5 different places to train and to get the right training for sparring or boxing or whatever. So I just focused mainly on jiu-jitsu and really just jiu-jitsu, not as a sport, but jiu-jitsu as an all-encompassing universal thing where it's self-defense, it's everything, kind of like all in one thing, one category, just jiu-jitsu, which is what it always was. You just had a tournament and prepared for it, or had a fight and prepared for it. It wasn't like your training is constant preparation for the tournament. It's jiu-jitsu is just this thing about fighting and defending yourself and lifestyle. So, and I knew with that, I knew I wanted to become something where anybody could do it. So I did kind of revitalize the programs and change up curriculum and create some structure and order so that there was a more diversified group training, you know, and people that were middle-aged and just wanted something recreational to do, they could have a place without getting injured or without feeling intimidated or things like that. So I took the gym, I like changed all the logos, I changed all the color patterns, all the color schemes, the change of branding, changed the way I marketed it so that it was more appealing for families and for people and stuff. And that was kind of what I did back then. And that's been the constant process for me, like making it better. So yeah, around that time period, I just took the MMA out and just focused on making it a place for everybody.
So what do you feel like is the vision for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Like if you were going to describe what it should do for people and do for the world, what would it be?
Jiu-jitsu it's a cliche, it's become a cliche, but jiu-jitsu is really a lifestyle. It's this martial art that is real, number one. So you're learning an actual real skill to defend yourself. And you can feel the reality of it because you're doing it. You're actually physically connected to a person and you're with a person, you're controlling them, you're escaping. So that level of confidence from that reality is immeasurable. And so, you know, having a person be in a jiu-jitsu room around like-minded people who are health-oriented, who are living good lives, generally speaking, and who are developing this confidence from this real martial art, you become so empowered. It's almost indescribable, you know, and it's really, it's something that's not even conscious either. It becomes you, you know, so you train jiu-jitsu for so long that now you speak your mind better. You're not afraid to stand up for yourself. You make decisions better. So it's like in the beginning, you end up just wanting to learn a martial art for some fitness or for some self-defense. And then all of a sudden you start realizing that you're literally learning life on the mats. You're learning how to live. Like that's one of the things we use for a while. Like it's training for life. Like you're learning how to deal with situations, how to become more patient. And you don't realize this process is taking place. And then as it starts to become more evident, as you start to see patterns emerge and you start to see that that's real, like it's really happening. It's like a religious awakening. It's like an enlightenment almost. So I really believe that jiu-jitsu has this power to awaken people. That's why my logo is kind of like it's like a duality, kind of like a yin yang almost, but it's an eye also, representation of becoming awakened or enlightened through jiu-jitsu training, which is what it does. So I really think that jiu-jitsu is that lifestyle that they talk about that enlightens you to a world of possibilities that you never thought could have existed. And it makes every single aspect of your life better because you understand how to approach situations differently, strategize. So it's a lifestyle that shows you the best way to live in the world. not just from beating people up, but from learning how to deal with things. So that's
Yeah,
kind of my personal take on it.
almost like an extreme coping mechanism for the construct of life.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, that's a great way to say it too. And not just a coping mechanism, but so we live in this world of, as you said, like a construct of life, and with this socially constructed world, generally speaking. But even that's even a conversation in itself, like beyond our realm of what we understand, because it's more complex than we realize. But um, it's obvious that there's a deep meaning to jiu-jitsu, to like what it does, to watch it change people, to watch people like and I think it's almost like it's almost impossible to describe at times too, because like other things too, because it is so powerful that it's hard to articulate even in words.
Yeah, no, I agree, man. It definitely has a rooted impact on people.
Yeah.
So if you had to look back at like leaders and mentors, who do you feel like has been some of your major influences of leadership that's like really helped shift your perspective on thinking about jiu-jitsu and just what it's about, what it means? Like, how have you been influenced and directed by leaders in your life?
Yeah, I think early on, Chad Beatty, who's the guy I first met, like he was definitely that. And then as time went on, I had a good friend of mine, Frank Popolizio. He's runs a big wrestling club up here. He was impactful in my life, like in terms of business and learning how to push for things and how to really attack things and go after them, which is how I kind of like developed the confidence to approach Hickson and be, getting close with Hickson and things like that. And then with Ricardo Almeida and Matt Serra, like the more time I spent training with those guys, like those guys I started to emulate and, and basically do impressions of when I was teaching. So there was different each time period, and then spending a lot of time with Hickson, like that was like really eye-opening for me in many ways. And that was a turning point for my gym also, when I kind of did like another shift and adjustment. But yeah, I think over time, like there was some people early on, like Chad Beatty, Frank Popolizio. Frank I still, have a lot of contact with, and Matt Serra, Ricardo Almeida, Hickson, guys like that changed my way of thinking in many ways.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get to the largest BJJ seminar ever.
Yeah, in American history.
Tell us the story, man. Tell us the story.
Yeah. So when I took over my gym, I had this idea of like, we're 3 hours north of New York City. So I was like, okay, if I'm going to I want to grow my gym and I want to grow jiu-jitsu selflessly in the area that I'm in, which it's not totally selfless because obviously it will help me because I'm involved in it. But I really wanted to grow jiu-jitsu in my area. So I knew to do that, in order to create kind of a hotbed, so to speak, I had to make things bigger. I had to do things bigger, which was the mentality and idea that I took from my friend Frank Popolizio, who was doing that in the wrestling world. Bringing John Smith here every year from Oklahoma, bringing Dan Gable here, bringing guys that don't go outside of their Oklahoma or Iowa bubble to upstate New York every year. So, and when he did that, he all of a sudden, he created this hub for wrestling. Now, some of the biggest tournaments in the world take place in our area for wrestling, which a lot of people don't even realize. So I wanted to do that for jiu-jitsu. So I wanted to start hosting seminars, having people in for seminars, which is always a normal thing. But I wanted to be like more aggressive with it. I wanted to have big ones. I wanted to have, I was willing to lose money in order to do it. Like I wasn't doing it for any financial benefit even. If anything, I was taking a major financial loss in most of it. But I had two goals when I first opened my gym, bought it out. I wanted to get Hickson Gracie for a seminar because Hickson was the reason I started. And I wanted to get Hickson. Hickson, I was the biggest fan of forever. In 2010, I went to my first Hickson seminar, and it totally changed my thinking. It was like 6 hours in Virginia, Pedro Sowers. Totally changed my thought process in jiu-jitsu. And so I was like, okay, I want to get that because I want to bring that to my students. So initially, I just wanted to bring Hickson in for just a seminar at my gym. That was my game plan, but he's not really accessible. So and this is the power of networking also. I had a friend who's a black belt at Hickson Gracie's now. He came out to our gym in like 2008, around that time period. He was just a blue belt, visiting some family up in our area. And he trained with us, and he told us, like, oh yeah, I train at Hickson's. I was like, wow, that's cool. And I remember this guy being pretty, like, he wasn't a wrestler or anything crazy, but for a blue belt, I remember him having like I was almost a brown belt and I was having like a tough time with him. And I'm like, man, he's got some really solid, fundamental, basic skills that I wasn't used to seeing at that belt level. And he trained at Hickson's. So I stayed in contact with him all those years, just because as a friend, but also like, you know, one day I want to go out there and maybe train. Like, I bet I want to know somebody. So when I had to do the Hickson seminar, I reached out to him, and Hickson wasn't really around, you know, so he wasn't accessible. So then after a couple weeks, he gave me Hickson's daughter's email. I started emailing her. A couple weeks after that, she said, here's my dad's email. He said to email him. So I emailed Hickson, didn't hear anything. I sent a second email, and he got back to me. He's like, hey, thanks, but no thanks, basically. Like, I'd love to do it, but I'm starting this federation and we're just starting out. That's my focus. So I'm not doing seminars anymore. So I was like, all right. So I was just like, I was reading this book at the time by a guy, Jerry Weintraub, called If I Stop Talking, You'll Know I'm Dead. And in that book, Jerry Weintraub woke up from a dream that he wanted to be Elvis Presley's manager. And it's just like the craziest thing ever. So he emailed Elvis's manager every day for a year, or not emailed, back then it was called. He called him every day for a year. And finally one day the guy called him back and said, hey, do you want to be Elvis's manager? So that was kind of his story. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do that for this. I'm just going to email and email and email and email until something happens. And then finally one day Hickson called me, and I was stuttering and stammering on the phone. I didn't know what to say. I had this whole thing planned I wanted to say, but none of it made sense. And he basically was like, stop emailing me. You know, that was the first part. No, but he was like, we had a good conversation, and he basically left it at, I still don't want to do any seminars, but if you ever come out to LA, you know, look me up, one of those. So I go, okay, I'll be there Monday. And this is Friday. And he goes, he just kind of laughed. I was like, no, seriously, are you going to be around next week? I'll come out. This is 2013. And he's like, yeah, sure, I'll be around. Come on out. Let me know when you're here. So we hung up. So I didn't have, you know, much money at all at that time. And I had a friend, Frank, loan me some money to go out. He's like, you have to go. And I'm thinking in my head, I'm like, I don't even have a plan to meet this guy. Like, he didn't give me a time or a day or anything. So I just went to LA, and I just said, I'm going to find him. And I was, you know, calling him. He's like, maybe tomorrow. So I'm calling back home, and my wife, and, you know, at the time she wasn't my wife, my girlfriend, and people I trained with, they're like, when are you meeting him? Aren't you supposed to this or that? I go, yeah, don't worry. Meanwhile, in my head, I'm like stressing out, like, I'm out here, I don't know where I am. Yeah. And so finally he's like, I'll be at Crohn's tomorrow at 5, meet me there. So I met him there, and we talked for a long time. And then I went out the next month, and I went out like 8 more times. One, because I was like very serious about the training and like really learning as a student. But 2, I really wanted to make something happen. And finally, a year later, 2 years later, after all of that, like 2 years of this struggle, we were having the 10th anniversary of our gym. And I said, hey, you know, we're having a 10th anniversary. I'd like to put on a massive, massive seminar. What do you think? He goes, okay, that's cool. I'll do it. And I was like, okay. So I was like, how many people? And he goes, how many mats can you get? And I go, I can get as many mats as you want. And I didn't have any mats for a seminar. Like, I had my gym, but I didn't have any extra mats. And he's like, you can get as many mats as I want. I go, yeah. He goes, all right, how about 300 people? I go, deal, you got it. And he goes, all right, you're going to need 8 40 by 40 mats. So I was like, 8 40 by 40 mats, you got it. Hung up the phone. So now I'm going, man, how am I going to get 8 40 by 40 mats? Flashback to my friend Frank, who runs the biggest wrestling club in the country. He's got 9 tournament mats that he uses for tournaments. So I called Frank, and I'm like, hey, Frank, in a month, I need your mats, like ASAP. I need them in Saratoga. I'm renting out this city center. I need all your mats. He's like, you don't need all my mats. I go, I need all. Hickson said, I need this many mats for this many people. So he goes, okay. So he gave me all of his mats. So then I marketed the heck out of the seminar, and it sold out in like a day. There was like 320 people, like first day. Everything was gone. And then a couple of years later, Hickson called me on the phone. He was like, hey, I'm thinking about doing the Hickson Gracie Cup in America. I go, oh, that's cool. That'd be awesome. And he goes, you want to host it? I was like, yeah, sure. That'd be easy. No problem. He's like, you done a tournament before? I go, no, yeah, but don't worry about it. Don't worry. We're good. And so I agreed to do that. And I did that. I ran that tournament with $0, no investment. I had no investment from anything, and put that tournament on. And that seminar was bigger than the first one, but that one was cheaper though. So it doesn't really, but yeah. So that was kind of that story of just this crazy couple of years of just pushing and just like being relentless. Not because I didn't make I'm not making money off this. Like, it's not a money making thing at all at that time period. But just because I wanted to experience it, I wanted my students to experience it, I wanted the people in this area to feel what I felt, because it was so powerful. Like, going back to what jiu-jitsu does for you. And I tell you what, like, that first seminar that we did, I can't even tell you how many people that I know that are friends now that met at that seminar or around that seminar leading up to it. Like guys like Jack with like Chris Howder, and these crazy connections that were made through it, which I knew was going to happen, but it was just a matter of like pushing and just being aggressive to make it happen.
I love to hear the all-in commitment with no resources, man, because I think a lot of people in the world, but especially in our industry, can really identify with that. Because, man, the number of times in my life that I'm like, yeah, no problem, hang up the phone and be like, oh crap, I got to learn how to do this today.
Yeah.
That's always awesome to hear, because it's that whole, if you're gonna gain something in life, if you're gonna get momentum, you got to be bold. You got to take the risk. And and that says something to people that are high level players, high achievers. Kind of earns their respect, because when you said, yeah, man, I'll see you Monday, that's kind of putting money where your mouth is. Like, you're committed. Versus they're
Yep.
like, yeah, when I'm out there for vacation, or at some point in 6 months or 12 months, when it's convenient for me, then I will see if it's convenient for you. Versus, no, I'm going to drop everything and make this a priority, because that just says so much about your character.
Yeah. I think now, it's kind of funny, like having a school for X amount of time, or like we've had our gym's been open for 14 years now. And I've seen this like social experiment play out over 14 years. Kids are different in 14 years than they were 14 years ago. Adults are different. And the mentality, I call it like the figure it out mentality. Like, how am I going to get there? You figure it out. That's what you do. You do anything that you could possibly do. And sometimes when you have no resources, that's when you're at your best, because it's survival, and I think people, and that in some sense I've learned from jiu-jitsu, making yourself vulnerable, exposing yourself to something that you have no ability at, getting your butt kicked, being willing to, and then coming back, and then learning though that anything's possible, that you can get beat up for 4 hours and then boom, catch a guy's arm, so over time, like through jiu-jitsu, like going back to the idea of like what jiu-jitsu gives you is that that anything is absolutely possible. It's just a matter of figuring it out and adapting things, and willing to kind of put yourself in compromising positions and be uncomfortable. But we have things like, I've put on these massive seminars, and I'll talk to people like, hey, you coming? And oh, I don't know, it's $100 and blah blah blah, whatever. I'm like, man, I had no money as a kid, and if you said Hickson Gracie was coming and it was going to be $100, I would have $100 in 20 minutes, any way possible. I'd go pander, I'd go anything, like. But it's kind of missing these days. I think jiu-jitsu is kind of a world where we see it happen. But yeah, that figure it out kind of push, and you understand it. That mentality of like, no, you get it done, you make it happen. Especially you in Arkansas, you're in an interesting area where it's a similar situation, maybe even more so in your area, because like the middle of nowhere, like, I mean, it's, and even in Arkansas, I'm sure the development of Jiu, have you been there your whole career? So the development was probably kind of crazy, in terms of people looking at jiu-jitsu differently or whatever.
Like my coach actually brought in a Brazilian back in like the late 90s, and that's where him and his club kind of got some momentum, is because they got connected to the root. But in the 90s, he was flying to train with other blue belts and purple belts, doing car washes and fundraisers, and
Yeah.
in the 90s trying to just go train with guys. And it was so hard. Even for me, like, I was watching VHS tapes, driving 2 hours one way to train with anybody that knew anything, and then trying to come back with your buddies that don't know anything, and like rolling
Yeah.
around the living room trying to do things. But I feel like what you're describing that's the transition when people always hear failure's not an option. Everybody's familiar with that, but a lot of
Mhm.
people don't know what that truly means, because
Right.
when failure is still an option, you only get to put 50% of your energy in one direction, because the other
Yeah.
50% is considering the other option. And even if it's 60% in one direction, it's still not full commitment. But when you reach a point of disparity or passion in which failure truly is not an option on the inside, you have 100% of your focus going only in one direction. And yeah, there's fear and there's paranoia, and the what ifs will pop up periodically, but you're not sitting back planning and structuring for when it falls apart, whenever it doesn't work. And I think that really roots into a lot of people have more of a fear of success than they actually have a fear of failure, because
For
they've
sure.
tasted failure and they know what that tastes like, and they know they
Yeah.
can go through it if they have to. But fear of success is, if you pull off this seminar, you go hang out with Hickson, now you're going to be measured by that standard.
Yeah.
Like, now your jiu-jitsu is going to be reflective of what one of the greatest players in the world thinks of it, versus your local buddy that you go train with and do a good job with. And then
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
you have this event of epic proportions that you now have to live up to, which some people shy away from because they're afraid of what that new standard is going to be. But others see that as the launching platform, because that will become the new norm, which, like, I'm sure it did for you. It became the new norm. So then you elevated and you played bigger.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, without question. And that fear of success is definitely true. And I think beyond the fear, it's also like a kind of a thought process that it's impossible in some sense until you've actually, like, when you go to New York or you go to LA, and you're surrounded by success. When no one's done it before, it's kind of like, it doesn't make any sense in your head. You can't even rationalize a reality where that's even possible. If I told you when I was a kid that Hickson Gracie, I'd be able to talk to him and go to his house and train and stuff like that, I would tell you I can't even imagine a world where that exists. Then over time, I started forcing it to become a reality, but it was definitely scary. Like, yeah, like, wow, what's going to happen when this does happen, or if this doesn't happen, or whatever. But I always had that mindset from the beginning. I remember being a kid and hearing an interview with Quentin Tarantino on some show, and he was talking about how he had no backup plan. He wouldn't give himself a backup plan because he knew that if he gave himself that backup plan, that it was going to always be there. And it's easier to go back. It's easier to fall back on that than it is to just go forward and just go do it.
Yeah.
So
And it's like, a lot of people won't even verbalize their hopes and dreams because it creates that external accountability toward
yeah,
now. I can remember the first time that it came out of my mouth that I wanted to be an MMA fighter, because for me, like, it meant so much. And for me to verbalize it, like, I know who I was with, I know where I was at, where we were parked, like, everything. I
right.
remember that moment in time, because for me, that was like so important. And me verbalizing and stating that as my dream and goal made it real, because now I was accountable. Now it was like, this is a friend that I'm accountable to, that is going to know that's what I want. And if I don't achieve that, he will know, and others will know. And I can remember just the nerves on me. And it's just such a simple, silly statement, when you look at it in the grand scheme of life. But when we put emotional value on something, like, that's a major transition. And there's people out there that have that same feeling when they just want to walk into your gym because they want to be better people.
Yeah, yeah, totally. That's
Yeah.
absolutely true.
Well, man, that is definitely an amazing story. I love all the history and what you've been able to create, and what you've built with your relationships. All the guys I know that have trained with you or spent time with you all speak very highly of you. And it
Awesome.
makes
Appreciate
a
that.
lot of sense, that you are just trying to create something within the industry that benefits everyone, both the originators and the white belts. And so, really appreciate you spending time with us today. We'll definitely be staying in touch, and maybe we'll do
Awesome.
another mega seminar, and we'll all come to New York.
Yeah, that'd be great, man. That'd be awesome.
All right, man. I hope you have a great weekend. We'll talk
You
soon.
too. Thanks, man.